Great. I think let's kick things off. Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining today's webinar, Voices for Change, Who's Leading the Fashion Revolution? I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today, in my case, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Hello, I'm Sam Platt, Commercial Partnerships Manager for Fairtrade Australia and New Zealand. Delighted to be joining you today for today's webinar. Just before we get started, a couple pieces of housekeeping. You'll have noticed that you're automatically put on mute and with your cameras off. You won't be able to change that. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to make use of the Q&A box, and we will hopefully have some time at the end of today's discussion to answer any questions that you may have, and we'd love to have your questions throughout. So fashion is the topic of today's conversation, and I'll just kick things off by speaking a little bit about Fairtrade to those of you who may be less familiar with what we do. So Fairtrade is the most trusted ethical label in the world. Businesses that certify their products as Fairtrade mitigate risks in their supply chain and add credibility to their social and environmental mission. Now, when we talk about the fashion industry at Fairtrade, we are often talking about Fairtrade cotton because cotton is the fiber that we certify as Fairtrade. So here's some statistics from our latest impact report, specifically about Fairtrade cotton. There are currently 24 certified cotton producer organizations around the world, but predominantly those are based in India. We work with just over 41,000 Fairtrade cotton farmers, of which 33% are female, and 64% of Fairtrade cotton is produced as both Fairtrade and organic certified. And we see a lot of co-benefits there between those two certifications on the social and the environmental side. Now, one headline statistic from Fairtrade cotton is that in 2023, just under 2.5 million Australian dollars was generated from the sales of Fairtrade cotton globally, and that money went directly back into the hands of those farming communities, those 41,000 farmers that I spoke about, and they could decide amongst themselves in their cooperatives how they wanted to invest that money to improve their businesses and their communities. So that investment just generated from the sales of Fairtrade cotton globally really does make a huge difference at the farm level. But one thing that's true as well is that only 20% of the cotton that's produced on Fairtrade terms reaches the market on Fairtrade terms, which means that there's so much headroom there for increasing those Fairtrade sales and ultimately those premiums going back to those farming communities and that investment that's so important. Now, part of the reason why we're meeting today is to celebrate World Fair Trade Day, which happens to be this year, this Saturday, the 10th of May. The World Fair Trade Day campaign is organized by the World Fair Trade Organization as part of the global World Fair Trade movement. This year's campaign is to raise awareness about the importance of business models. We don't only want to see sustainable products, but also whole businesses that are changing the way our economic system operates. By prioritizing people, planet, and sustainable profit, and incorporating the 10 Fair Trade principles, which you can see here on screen, we believe that businesses can become a source for positive change. And that's fundamentally why we want to have today's conversation with our friends at Baptist World Aid, and I'm really delighted to have them here to share their expertise off the back of their 10th edition of their Ethical Fashion Guide and Report, which was produced last year. I'm pleased to introduce our expert speaker for today, Gina Snodgrass. Gina is the advocacy specialist at Baptist World Aid Australia and led the research for the 10th edition Ethical Fashion Report. With a background in fashion design and international development, she's passionate about supporting companies to reduce worker exploitation and improve supply chain transparency. So Gina, good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Sam.
Wonderful. So to kick things off, Gina, could you briefly walk us through how the guide is developed and what criteria are used to assess brands?
Yeah, absolutely. So the research process for the Ethical Fashion Guide and Report actually starts about a year before we publish. And so we have a long list of industry contacts who we reach out to, each representing one of the companies that we assess. And at the same time, each year we're looking for any new relevant brands to include. And this year, we actually added a brand request form on our ethical fashion guide page so that everyday Aussies who are interested in the research that we do can actually request for their favourite brand to be included in our research, depending if they meet our criteria. And on that note, our criteria for including a brand in the research is brands that have an annual turnover of more than 50 million Australian dollars and have a strong presence in the Australian retail market. So they're the brands that everyday Aussies are shopping at. And so once we have our complete list of brands that we'll be including in the research, we generate a survey of 48 questions for each brand, and then we go through and pre-fill or pre-populate all the information that we can find publicly available through their modern slavery statements, sustainability reports, and any sort of online publishing reporting that they do. And then we share the survey with each fashion company. And then a lot of brands will share evidence with us, and it's a really collaborative research process. And then for other brands that might choose not to engage, we actually fill out the full survey on their behalf based on their information that's publicly available. And so we move from this initial survey stage through to a draft and then final review. And that process takes about 3 to 4 months in total. And then part of this process is also working with industry certification schemes like Fairtrade so that we can understand what the impact of participating in these standards would have on a company's performance. And then at the end of the research process, we peer review each company's survey to ensure that we're being really consistent and fair across the assessment of different brands, as we have a team of 3 researchers and we just want to make sure that there is consistency there. So after this is time to generate the scores, which is the part that everyone is most excited to find out about. And we have this huge data set of 13,000 data points that we use to analyse what the key findings and trends that we're seeing in the industry are, and then use that to write up the ethical fashion report. And then around the launch of the report, we've had a really successful launch campaign the past few years, and consumers just love to find out about the brands that they like shopping at and to see whether they can feel confident with their purchases or look for an alternative. And with our launch last year, we had around 5 million Australians engage with either the guide or the report, which was really encouraging. And then post-launch is the stage that we find ourselves in now, which is when we continue to consult with companies on how they can make improvements on their score for the next report. And we also have a back and forth process going through their survey to see how they can use that survey as sort of a benchmark of how their practices are going. And then we make recommendations to them on any sort of opportunity areas that they might want to dig a little deeper into over the coming year.
Thanks so much, Gina. That's really helpful to get that full overview of the process. And having been part of it as a certifier, I can definitely say it's a highly detailed and robust process that you go through. And those 13,000 data points, that's a huge piece of work. So congratulations to you and the team for that really important piece of work as well. You mentioned in there around, part of the reason for it is seeing how the industry is progressing and some of the key findings. So what were the key findings or surprises from this time round with the ethical fashion guide?
Yeah, so in last year's publication, we assessed 120 companies, and that represents 460 brands, as a lot of the companies we assess are parent companies, which might have a number of brands that they're in control of the supply chain. And so out of those 120 companies, about half of those companies engaged in the process. So they're the companies that submitted evidence and we worked closely with. And then the other half were those that either didn't engage for different reasons or didn't respond to our request. And so they're the ones that we assessed on public information. And I would say the biggest surprise from last year, and probably also the biggest disappointment, was our finding that the company average was only 31 out of 100. So this is quite low. It would be considered a fail in a lot of standard scoring systems. And we also saw that average only increased 2 points since the last time we assessed these majority of those companies in 2022. And so we've moved to a 2-year reporting cycle. And so we were really hoping, just considering that companies had a year off between reports, that we would see more progress. And so if you break down that sort of 2 points out of 100 over 2 years, that's a rate of 1% progress each year, which is, it is very slow. And we're really hoping to see that shift in future reporting cycles. But in saying that, I think that we did also see significant progress in a smaller cohort of companies that did actively participate in the research and did engage in using that survey as a benchmarking tool year on year. And for that cohort who were engaged in the research for multiple years, they actually scored 16 points higher than the industry average. So they got 47 out of 100. So it does show that, there is definitely forward momentum for companies that do want to prioritize ethics and sustainability. But as a whole, the industry is still moving quite slowly, I'd say.
Yeah, thanks, Gina. I think a lot of us would probably share those reflections of the disappointment that maybe the industry as a whole is still taking its time to move and moving quite slowly. And then there's such a big gap, between the businesses that are doing best practices and then maybe the kind of average in the industry, as you said, being around 31 points is still very low. So, I guess I'd love to pick your brain a bit more on some of what are the common areas where brands continue to fall short, and why do you think that is?
Yeah, I would say year on year, the key area that brands really struggle to make progress is payment of a living wage. And then sort of adjacent to that is responsible purchasing practices. And they're also quite connected, which I will explain. But yeah, paying a living wage is seen as really complex and quite costly. That's sort of the perception it has for a lot of brands. One of our top performing brand, Mighty Good Basics, they were actually one of only 2 brands that were able to evidence paying a living wage at their final stage factories, which is a great achievement. But if you think that only 2 out of 120 companies could evidence this, it just really demonstrates that the fashion company is more and more geared to prioritizing low cost, fast turnaround garments, which results in suppliers not being able to pay their workers fairly. We recognize that payment of a living wage is definitely complex and it's sort of multifaceted and lots of things contribute to it. But there are some really simple things that brands can do to get started, to get things moving in the right direction. And one of them is having a responsible purchasing practices policy. So this relates to a company taking steps to understand and mitigate sort of the impact of their own purchasing decisions and what they have on suppliers. An example of that is, a company might have a code of conduct where they state that factories must not subject workers to extreme overtime, but then they could have a practice of making very last minute order changes or rush jobs, which then put pressure on suppliers, which puts pressure on their workers to work longer hours. So you can see how sometimes a company's policies can be in direct contrast to what their practices are. And so having a responsible purchasing practices policy, it's a bit of a tongue twister, we just call it an RPP. So having an RPP in place that states what their policy is towards things like paying on time and forecasting realistically and avoiding last minute changes to orders can really have a big difference in the stability of their suppliers and then the well-being of workers further down the supply chain. And in last year's research, we found that only 35% of companies do have an RPP in place. And so if you have a think about, it's really just an internal policy that they train their teams on. That is quite a low percentage for a policy that, might take one person a bit of research to understand what's required, what the implications are, how they can sort of tweak their internal practices a little bit. But it doesn't require a huge investment. And it ensures that their policies are in line with their sort of ethical sourcing goals and that their practices are also in line with those as well.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really interesting point around the potential contradictions between, I guess, policies and practices potentially. And one question I have off the back of that, have you have any good examples of kind of best practice of Because I think it's important when you have those policies that I guess you're measuring yourself against that and keeping yourself accountable. I wonder if there's any businesses or just examples of businesses that are doing that in a really good way.
Yeah, I guess Mighty Good Basics is our sort of best in class case study who, sort of across the board have a lot of these internal policies in place that also match their external practices. And I think it does depend on where a company is up to, like how far along their ethical sourcing journey they are. The first point is really writing policies. So that could be ensuring that you have a code of conduct in place. And then the next step is fully understanding, training internal teams, making sure everyone's on board so that each person can sort of implement that policy in the work that they do. So, yeah, I think it really depends where a company's up to. You can't expect, companies to go from 0 to 100. It just doesn't work like that. So, yeah, we're just really through this work hoping to work alongside companies to sort of bring them further up the journey.
Yeah, that's great. Absolutely. And I think that brings us nicely on to my next question, which is what distinguishes the top performing brands in the guides? What are they doing differently from the rest of the industry?
Yeah, definitely. So we found that the top performing brands sort of across the board, they, like I was saying, they don't treat ESG as a responsibility of a single team. It's not just a sustainability team's problem, but instead it's something that they've embedded, ethical and sustainable practices into the core of their business. And made it everyone's responsibilities, which is something that we do see Mighty Good Basics doing. From the onset, the way that they built their business was sort of embedding ethics and sustainability at the core. So this can often start with making sure, job descriptions and KPIs across departments reflect a company's ESG priorities and making sure that that is spread across the entire organization. It also means, we see companies conducting internal training and having really clear communication to their different teams so that they understand what their role is and how their role is contributing to having an ethical supply chain. So this can look like the design team choosing sustainable materials or designing with circularity in mind. It's the production and buying teams having trust and transparency with their suppliers in their practices. It's looking at the finance team to ensure that payments are made on time and that, there's really fair contract terms that look out for both the suppliers and the business. And it's this kind of cross-functional ownership that sets the leaders apart in the research that we've found. It's, we can see that ethics and sustainability sort of seep into all parts of the business and it's not just sort of siloed in one area.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point and something that, often comes up in conversations that I have with teams, but also at sustainability conferences. It's all about how do we embed sustainability across a business so that it's not just one team or one person's responsibility. And it's not an afterthought as well. It's always needs to be front of mind in all the decisions that are made across the full business. So it's great to see that there are some businesses out there already implementing that. And obviously it's a call to action for the others in the industry to start changing the way that they practice as well. We've mentioned them already a few times. So Mighty Good Basics were the highest scoring brand in the guide with a score of 90 points. I think just over 20 points higher than the next highest brand. Very much at the top of the pile there. I know that they implement a range of sustainability activities across their full range of what they do. So across ethical production, across environmental responsibility and transparency. I know they're doing some work on circularity, which you just mentioned as well. But I'm also really pleased to say that they use Fairtrade certified cotton in all of their garments. So I just wanted to ask you, what benefits does Fairtrade certification have for a brand and how they are assessed in the guide?
I mentioned earlier that we actually run our full research process of the ethical fashion survey with all of the certifiers that we engage in the project. And at the moment, that includes Fairtrade, Global Organic Textile Standard, Cotton Australia, Better Cotton, and Leather Working Group. These are the certifications that we see companies most commonly using, and if there was a new certification that we saw lots of companies using, we'd consider to include them as well. And so we assess each of these certifications. I did this process with Sam, and we go through the full survey to get a really clear evidence-based understanding of what the Fairtrade standard covers against our methodology. And then when a brand sources through one of these certifications, so Mighty Good Basics sourcing Fairtrade cotton, we're then able to apply the score of Fairtrade to the relevant parts of the survey, depending how much a company might source through that certification. And so this really helps make the process a lot more streamlined for brands, and it will avoid sort of a number of brands reaching out to a certification to ask them questions about what their standards cover. And so for Mighty Good Basics, in the case of Fairtrade cotton, one of the benefits that it provides a brand is the assurance of what that standard, or the different sort of risk mitigation and protections to workers that a standard might have in place that a company can then be assured of through sourcing through Fairtrade cotton, for example. And then that will flow on to different areas of the survey, for example, sort of supply relationships and human rights monitoring. We're able to then pass on the credit that Fairtrade gets to each brand at different questions throughout the survey.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think just from my perspective, the process, I think it was really eye-opening for me as well, not being necessarily an expert in the fashion industry, but coming to it from a fair trade perspective and the commodity perspective. I think seeing where fair trade fits into that, but also being aware that it's not the whole story of a fashion business, and they've got to think about such a range of different issues across their full supply chain, from fiber choices, but also through to things like circularity and other areas as well. So it was quite an interesting, just to say, interesting and eye-opening process for us as well as a certifier to really understand the breadth of what these businesses are trying to make positive change on in so many different areas, but also where certifications can potentially add additional value potentially as well. So yeah, it was a great process. One thing we've talked about it already a little bit, but I'd love to get your thoughts on. I know that you've been doing this for a number of years. This is the 10th edition of the report. The last one was in 2022. What were some of the major shifts or trends among brands between this edition and the previous? And what do you think that says about the direction the industry is heading in?
Yeah, there were a few different key shifts that have stood out. I'd say that we've seen more brands taking steps towards improving their traceability and then also their transparency. And we had around 30% of companies publish their public supplier list for their final stage facilities, which is a really positive move because in the past we've seen a lot of pre-competitiveness from companies in sharing details like their supplier lists. But it is a really important step for companies to take because it ensures that there are certain protections in place if there is transparency on where different products are being produced and which factories are producing them. We also saw 47% of companies having a fully traced final stage supply chain, which is really positive. It's almost half of the companies know exactly who's producing all of their final stage products. And then 12% have traced not only their final stage, but also their inputs. So while it is still a low number, 12% is not, we want to see it much higher. It is great to see that companies are starting to trace beyond tier 1 into areas like inputs and fabric production. And I think it really signals that there's a growing recognition across the industry that risks don't stop at the final stage of production. And to really have meaningful oversight of your supply chain, you need to be looking past those final stage producers. And I'd say another notable shift was just an increased focus on sustainability. More brands are talking about their environmental impact, and I think that is because it's, increasingly top of mind for consumers, but also because a lot of brands are anticipating new sustainability reporting requirements that we're seeing coming into effect across the globe. So we saw 21% of companies using sustainable fibres in more than half of their production volume, which was up from 15% in 2022. And, this is really encouraging to see. And I'd say that this trend sort of suggests that the industry is beginning to respond more and more to public pressure and regulatory pressure. But we're just really hoping that the next stage will be moving sort of broad sustainability claims that we see companies make into really measurable actions, like having, a really great water and chemical stewardship program in place, or designing more circular products, because as I'm sure everyone has been susceptible for sort of greenwashing and sort of blanket statement sustainability claims. It's showing that brands are becoming more and more aware of sustainability and the environmental impact being top of mind for consumers, but we really want to see their actions sort of back up those claims and have it be really tangible.
Thanks, Gina. There's so much to unpack in that. And I think I would certainly encourage anyone who hasn't yet to go in and have a detailed read of the report, because I think what's really interesting, as you were saying, around the pressures on businesses to make change from the consumer side, from the government or legislative side, even from the media. All of those pressures are growing, which is great, and we're seeing brands make progress off the back of that. But I just say that the report has a really great set of recommendations for each of those actors. There's a set of recommendations for governments, recommendations for consumers, etc. So I really would encourage anyone who hasn't yet to go in and have a detailed read of that report and those recommendations, because I think they're great in hopefully moving the industry forward. Talking of moving the industry forward, we know that the fashion industry is highly complex and therefore change can be slow. So what keeps you hopeful and motivated to keep pushing for transformation, especially as a voice of the business revolution, to go back to today's theme?
Yeah, I'd say that depending what survey I've been reviewing for the day, my hopefulness varies. But I'd say on a whole, what keeps me motivated is knowing that there is progress happening, but while it is slow, it is moving in the right direction. As I've alluded to, it does feel slow, but when we zoom out, we can see a shift underway. And we're really seeing that ethical sourcing and sustainability are no longer fringe concerns for both companies and consumers, but they're really becoming central to how businesses operate and how people want to choose to shop. There's growing pressure from consumers, investors, regulators, for companies to take responsibility for their supply chain. It's not enough to just come up with a great product and not care how it's produced or what the final impact of that product is. And it's that external pressure that helps push change from, things on the margins to things becoming more mainstream. And I'd say that just seeing that consistent push for, ethical sourcing and sustainability to become more of a mainstream concern is something that really motivates me. And it's even if it's one company lifting their standards, that is slow progress, but the ripple-on effect for both workers and the environment is real. And so it's really one by one, each company changing their practices, holding these issues more core to how they do business. I think that is what keeps me going and what makes me hopeful for the industry.
Thanks. Yeah, I fully echo everything that you've just said. And I think to build on that, I think that every purchase does matter. As I mentioned very briefly at the beginning around, every purchase generates a certain amount of premium that goes back to a farming community. I think the purchase decisions that consumer makes can have a real impact, and that's definitely a cause for optimism. So we'll jump now into a few questions I can see we've received from our audience today. There's a couple questions here which are around the criteria for why a brand can be chosen and why the threshold of 50 million or more for inclusion in the report. Maybe you can speak to a little bit to that, Gina.
Yeah, so we introduced the criteria a few years ago, and I guess it comes down to helping us to create a company list that we feel is most relevant for majority of Australians. And we set the bar at 50 million because while we don't necessarily think that the companies making the most progress are sitting above 50 million, we do see those companies as the ones that have the biggest impact and the biggest potential of positive change if they were to change their practices. They're producing the most garments, they're employing the most suppliers, which provides jobs for the most garment workers. And so we're really focused on helping those larger players shift their practices so that we can see flow-on effect. Because really, the reason that we do this work is to improve the conditions for garment workers across the world. That's the reason that we target those sort of top revenue-generating companies, because we believe they have the most potential of positive impact.
Thanks. Another question we have here is whether Fairtrade or Baptist World Aid have a template for responsible purchasing practices policy. I'm going to struggle to say that as well.
Yeah.
Maybe you can go first.
Yeah, we don't necessarily have a template, but our methodology is included in the report, and that really steps out some of the expectations we have of companies in terms of their responsible purchasing practices policy. But yeah, that could be something that we would consider sort of formalizing if a brand reached out to us wanting that. But I'd say that is the best starting place.
Great. Yeah, from the Fairtrade side, I am not aware of a template that we could share, but certainly there are criteria in the Fairtrade standards with regards to responsible purchasing practices in both the trader standards, the small producer organization standards, etc. So I'd recommend having a look at those standards, which are publicly available, for those criteria to see exactly what they are. But certainly it's a major part of what the Fairtrade standards exist to do. Yeah, another question for you, Gina. I think one which it maybe is an oversimplification, but if there was one recommendation that every brand in the guide could implement that would make the biggest difference, do you have one that jumps out to mind?
Yes, it would be payment of a living wage without a question. I think, yeah, if every brand in our research took that one step, it would absolutely have the most immediate and transformative impact. Paying workers a living wage means that people can meet their basic needs like food, housing, healthcare, and also means that they can live with dignity. It lifts families out of poverty, supports local economies, helps break cycles of exploitation. And I also think that, paying a living wage is not just about the pay itself, but it's what it signals. And, when a brand commits to paying a living wage, it's saying that workers' well-being matters just as much as our margins. And so I really believe that it would set a new standard of fairness and accountability across the supply chain. And it also creates the foundation for progress in other areas, because when workers are paid fairly, they're more empowered, they're more secure. They can better advocate for safe conditions and long-term change. In saying that, I've mentioned it's not easy. It is a really challenging area for companies to move towards achieving, but in terms of impact, that would be it.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, as you said, it's challenging, but it's also aspirational. And there are a number of brands across different industries, like thinking of cocoa and coffee, for example, as well, that there's a big shift there towards moving to payment of living incomes and living wages. So it's great that if for the fashion industry to follow along with that as well. And I'd encourage anyone who's interested in the topic of living wages and living incomes, again, obviously to read the report, but also to have a look at Fairtrade's work in that space and some of the methodologies that we've been part of with the Global Living Wage Coalition to even start just at the very basic start by calculating what a living income or living wage looks like in certain countries and certain industries. So that's obviously an important starting point for anyone that's interested. This is another question that's come in from the audience. Does Baptist World Aid have any particular policies for internal purchasing alongside the work that you do?
Yeah, that is something that we're definitely, we want to make sure that we're walking the walk and not just talking the talk. And so for our sort of internal merchandise procurement, so we produce a Better World Gifts tote bag as well as Baptist World Aid t-shirts. And we make sure that we definitely do our due diligence on the total supply chain practices of those garments and products being produced, and payment of living wage is definitely core to something that we're making sure that we're verifying for those different objects. I've also been working with someone in our campaigns team recently who's doing a sustainability audit of our paper suppliers to make sure that we know what the supply chain looks like. We understand, what the different certifications, different paper suppliers are working by. It's been a really interesting process for me because I fully understand fashion supply chains and why you can sort of apply the same foundational structure to different industries. There's a lot of nuance that comes with each industry. So that is something that, we make sure that we are doing our due diligence in new suppliers that we bring on board.
That's great to hear. Yeah, certainly every industry is very, very different. Yeah, I guess in my role working across lots of different industries, including fashion, but also coffee, cocoa, etc., they all have their particular challenges. But it's great when businesses can make responsible purchasing across their entire procurement a thing. And so that's why we implemented as Fairtrade a small plug for our Fairtrade Supporting Workplaces scheme. For anyone out there that's part of a workplace that wants to have fair procurement across everything that they do, I'd suggest checking that out. To be part of the scheme, you just need to regularly source 2 or more Fairtrade products. That could be coffee or tea for your kitchens, and then you qualify to become a Fairtrade supporting workplace. And as I said before, every purchase matters and does make an impact for farmers. So anyone out there who works for a business that's interested, please do get in touch with us. You can find more information on our website about that. Okay, I think that was all of the questions that I had and that we had from our audience today. But before wrapping up, I'd just like to finish by saying we're all consumers on this call as well, obviously. So if you are looking for your next ethical fashion purchase, I'd obviously highly recommend looking at the guide as a starting point, but also some wonderful fashion brands that are using Fairtrade cotton already. We've spoken about Mighty Good Basics, but there's also other brands out there such as Koto, Etico, MacPack, who I'm wearing today, their Fairtrade cotton jumper. So yeah, certainly have a look at the guide and the businesses that are doing fair trade when you make your next purchase, because it does make a difference. So yeah, I'd like to finish by thanking you, Gina, for sharing your expertise. I found it really valuable to learn a lot more in depth about the report and the guide and the work that you do, and congratulate you once again on what is a huge piece of work. And I know you're probably starting to ramp up now for the next round. Looking forward to being a part of that process again, hopefully. Thank you, Gina, and happy World Fair Trade Day to everyone for this Saturday. Hope everybody has a great weekend and weeks ahead.
Thanks so much, Sam.
Thank you, Gina.